Margaret Sullivan had always been a force of nature, though at 72, her steel-gray hair and weathered hands might have fooled strangers into thinking she was just another elderly woman waiting for the bus. They would be wrong. Dead wrong. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen window of her small apartment in Boston as she carefully folded clothes into her worn leather suitcase. Each movement was precise, methodical, habits formed over decades of military discipline that civilian life had never quite erased. She was preparing for what should have been a joyful occasion, visiting her son Marcus at his new job in Chicago. Marcus had landed a position as a security consultant for Brennan Industries, a mid-sized manufacturing company that specialized in automotive parts. At 35, he was finally getting his life back on track after a difficult divorce and a period of unemployment that had tested both his confidence and his bank account. Margaret was proud of him, proud of how he'd rebuilt himself from the ground up, just like she taught him. The phone rang as she zipped her suitcase closed. Marcus's voice came through the speaker, warm but tinged with the exhaustion she'd grown to recognize over the past few months. "Hey Mom, just wanted to confirm your flight details again. I'll pick you up at O'Hare at 3:30. "I'm perfectly capable of taking a cab, son," Margaret replied, though her tone was affectionate rather than stern. "You don't need to leave work early for me." "Are you kidding? I've been looking forward to this visit for weeks. Besides, I want to show you around the office, introduce you to some of my colleagues. They've heard so much about you." Margaret smiled, remembering the stories Marcus used to tell his friends as a child, usually exaggerated tales of his mother's military service that made her sound like some kind of action movie hero. The reality had been far more complex, far more nuanced, but she'd never corrected him. Sometimes children needed their heroes to be larger than life. "Just remember, I'm not staying long," she warned, settling into her favorite armchair. "A week at most. I don't want to be in your way while you're still settling into the new job." "You could never be in my way, Mom. You know that." After hanging up, Margaret allowed herself a moment of maternal satisfaction. Marcus had inherited her resilience, her ability to bounce back from setbacks that would have crushed a lesser person. It was a trait that had served them both well over the years, though it had been tested more times than she cared to remember. The flight to Chicago was uneventful, filled with the usual mix of business travelers and tourists that populated midday flights. Margaret kept to herself, reading a paperback thriller and declining the flight attendants' offers of snacks and beverages. She'd learned long ago to travel light and stay alert, habits that had kept her alive in places where letting your guard down meant never going home. Marcus was waiting at the gate when she emerged from the jet bridge, his face lighting up with a genuine smile that reminded her of the little boy who used to wait by the window for her to come home from deployment. He'd grown into a good man, tall, broad-shouldered, with intelligent eyes that missed very little. The past year had been hard on him, but he was recovering, finding his footing again in a world that didn't always reward good people. "You look tired," she said after accepting his embrace, her trained eye noting the slight shadows under his eyes, the tension in his shoulders that he was trying to hide. "New job jitters," he replied with a shrug. "Still getting used to the corporate environment. It's different from what I'm used to." They made small talk during the drive into the city, Marcus pointing out landmarks and describing his new neighborhood with the enthusiasm of someone trying to convince himself as much as his listener that he'd made the right choice. Margaret listened, filed away details, and watched the city roll past the windows with the same careful attention she'd once given to foreign terrain. Marcus's apartment was small but clean, located in a converted warehouse district that was slowly transitioning from industrial to residential. He'd furnished it simply: a couch, a coffee table, a dining set that looked like it had come from a discount furniture store. There were no personal touches yet, no photographs or mementos that would make the space feel like home rather than just a place to sleep. "I know it's not much," Marcus said, following her gaze around the sparse living room. "But it's temporary. Once I get established at Brennan, I'll look for something better." "It's fine," Margaret assured him, though privately she wondered why a successful security consultant would need to live so modestly. "You always were practical about these things." That evening, over takeout Chinese food, Marcus told her more about his job. Brennan Industries was a family-owned company that had been passed down through 3 generations. The current CEO, Robert Brennan Jr., was supposedly committed to modernizing operations and expanding into new markets. Marcus had been hired to overhaul their security systems, both physical and digital, after a series of minor break-ins had highlighted vulnerabilities in their current setup. "It's good work," Marcus said, twirling lo mein around his chopsticks. "Challenging, but not overwhelming. The pay is decent, and there's room for advancement if I prove myself." "But?" Margaret prompted, hearing the unspoken reservation in his voice. Marcus hesitated, then set down his chopsticks. "There are some things about the company that don't quite add up. Nothing major, just inconsistencies in their operations. Equipment that doesn't match the manifest, shipments that arrive at odd hours, employees who seem nervous whenever management is around." "Corporate politics," Margaret suggested, though her instincts were already beginning to prickle. "Every company has its secrets, son. Sometimes it's better not to look too closely." "Maybe," Marcus agreed, but she could see the doubt in his eyes. "I just want to make sure I'm not walking into something that could blow up later. This job means everything to me, Mom. I can't afford another setback." Margaret reached across the small dining table and squeezed his hand. "You're overthinking it. You always were too careful for your own good." But, even as she offered reassurance, she was mentally cataloging the details he'd shared, cross-referencing them against patterns she'd learned to recognize during her years in naval intelligence. Sometimes being too careful was the only thing that kept you alive. The next morning, Marcus took her to Brennan Industries for the promised tour. The facility was located in an industrial park on the outskirts of the city, a sprawling complex of warehouses and office buildings surrounded by chain-link fencing topped with razor wire. Security was tight, multiple checkpoints, cameras at every entrance, guards who looked more like military contractors than typical corporate security. "Impressive setup," Margaret observed as they passed through the main gate. "Must be expensive to maintain all this." "Mr. Brennan says it's necessary," Marcus replied. "They handle some government contracts, so the security requirements are pretty strict." Inside, the offices were modern and well-appointed, with polished floors and expensive furniture that spoke of a company doing very well financially. Marcus introduced her to several of his colleagues, a mix of IT specialists, administrative staff, and middle managers who all seemed friendly enough, if somewhat guarded in their interactions. Robert Brennan Jr. himself was a surprise. Margaret had expected a typical corporate executive, expensive suit, firm handshake, practiced smile. Instead, she found herself facing a man in his early 40s who looked like he'd be more at home on a construction site than in a boardroom. He was built like a linebacker, with calloused hands and a direct manner of speaking that reminded her of some of the better officers she'd served under. "Mrs. Sullivan," Brennan said, gripping her hand with just the right amount of firmness. "Marcus has told me so much about you. Military background, right? Navy?" 26 years, Margaret confirmed, studying his face for tells. "Retired as a chief petty officer. My grandfather served in Korea," Brennan said. "Always had tremendous respect for the folks who put their lives on the line for the rest of us. Marcus here is cut from the same cloth, absolute professional, total integrity. We're lucky to have him." The praise seemed genuine, but Margaret noticed how Brennan's eyes never quite met hers directly, how his smile faded the moment he thought she wasn't looking. It was a technique she'd seen before, usually from people who had something to hide. The tour continued through various departments: accounting, human resources, the main production floor where workers assembled automotive components with industrial precision. Everything looked legitimate, even impressive, but Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that they were being shown only what Brennan wanted them to see. It was during lunch in the employee cafeteria that she first noticed the undercurrents of tension that Marcus had mentioned. Conversations would die when management walked past, workers would exchange glances that spoke of shared concerns they couldn't voice openly. The security guards, she realized, weren't just watching for external threats, they were monitoring the employees as well. "How long have you worked here?" she asked a young woman sitting at the next table, someone Marcus had introduced as Sarah from the accounting department. Sarah glanced around nervously before answering. "About 2 years. It's a good job. Steady work, decent benefits. But her body language told a different story: hunched shoulders, hands that fidgeted with her coffee cup, eyes that kept darting toward the exits as if she was calculating escape routes. Margaret had seen that kind of fear before, usually in civilians caught in conflict zones who'd learned to keep their heads down and ask no questions. After lunch, Marcus walked her back to the main entrance while he returned to his afternoon meetings. The visit had been enlightening in ways she hadn't expected, and none of them were particularly reassuring. "Nice place," she told him as they waited for her taxi to arrive. "Seems like you'll do well there." Marcus nodded, but she could see the uncertainty still lingering in his expression. "I hope so. I really need this to work out, Mom." "It will," she assured him, though privately she was already making mental notes about what she'd observed. "Just remember what I always taught you: trust your instincts. They're usually right." The taxi pulled up, and Margaret kissed her son goodbye, promising to see him for dinner that evening. But, as the car pulled away from Brennan Industries, she found herself studying the facility with new eyes, noting details that might prove important later. Something was wrong here. She could feel it in her bones, the same intuitive warning system that had kept her alive through 3 combat deployments and countless intelligence operations. Marcus was walking into something dangerous, something that could destroy the life he was working so hard to rebuild. And if that happened, if someone tried to hurt her son, they would learn exactly what kind of woman Margaret Sullivan really was. The tattoo on her shoulder, hidden beneath the conservative blouse she'd worn for the office visit, was a reminder of training and experiences that most people couldn't imagine. It depicted the SEAL Trident, earned during a classified assignment that officially never happened, in a conflict that wasn't supposed to exist. Margaret Sullivan had spent her career protecting her country. But there was nothing in the world she wouldn't do to protect her son. The taxi driver glanced in the rearview mirror, noting the change in his passenger's demeanor. Where moments before there had been a pleasant elderly woman, there was now something harder, more focused. Something that made him unconsciously press a little harder on the accelerator, eager to reach their destination. Margaret didn't notice his discomfort. She was already planning, already considering options and contingencies. Whatever was happening at Brennan Industries, whatever had put that look of fear in Sarah's eyes and uncertainty in Marcus's voice, she was going to find out. And, once she did, God help anyone who thought they could use her son as a pawn in whatever game they were playing. Margaret spent the rest of that afternoon walking through Marcus's neighborhood, ostensibly exploring the area but actually conducting surveillance. Old habits died hard, and her instincts were telling her that understanding the terrain might become important sooner than she'd like. The converted warehouse district was in transition, with trendy cafes and boutique shops slowly replacing auto repair shops and industrial supply companies. It was the kind of neighborhood where people minded their own business, where unusual activity wouldn't necessarily attract attention. Perfect for someone who wanted to disappear, but also perfect for someone who wanted to make other people disappear. She stopped at a coffee shop 2 blocks from Marcus's apartment and struck up a conversation with the barista, a pierced college student who seemed eager to talk about anything that would break up the monotony of the afternoon shift. "You're new to the area?" the girl asked, sliding Margaret's black coffee across the counter. "Visiting my son. He just started working at Brennan Industries." The barista's expression shifted slightly, enthusiasm dimming. "Oh. That place. You know it? Everyone around here knows it. Big employer, keeps a lot of families in work." The girl glanced around the empty cafe, then leaned closer. "But people don't really talk about what goes on there, you know? Like, my boyfriend's dad worked there for 15 years, and he never really explained what he did. Just said it was automotive parts and left it at that." Margaret filed away the information along with everything else she'd observed. A company that inspired both dependence and secrecy was rarely involved in legitimate business, at least not exclusively. That evening, Marcus picked her up for dinner at an Italian restaurant downtown. He seemed more relaxed away from the office, but Margaret could see the stress lines around his eyes, the way he unconsciously scanned the room when they were seated. He was developing the hypervigilance that came with working in an environment where you couldn't entirely trust your surroundings. "How was your first day back?" she asked after they'd ordered. "Productive. I'm making good progress on the security audit. Marcus paused, seeming to consider his words carefully. Though I did find some things that don't quite make sense. Such as? Marcus lowered his voice, even though the nearest other diners were several tables away. The computer system shows inventory coming in that doesn't match the shipping manifests. Either someone's very bad at paperwork, or they're moving things that aren't supposed to be recorded, Margaret finished. That's what I'm thinking. And, when I asked about it, Mr. Brennan said it was probably just clerical errors, told me not to worry about it unless it affected security protocols. Margaret sipped her wine, considering. Maybe he's right. Maybe you're looking for problems that don't exist. But, she could see in Marcus's expression that he wasn't buying that explanation any more than she was. He'd inherited her analytical mind along with her stubborn streak, and both were telling him that something was seriously wrong. There's something else, Marcus said, glancing around the restaurant again. I was reviewing the security camera footage from the past few months, looking for patterns that might indicate vulnerabilities. Most of it's routine employees coming and going, delivery trucks, maintenance crews. But there are these gaps. Gaps? Specific times when multiple cameras go dark simultaneously. Always between 2 and 4 a.m., always for exactly 90 minutes. The system logs show it as scheduled maintenance, but I checked with the vendor who installed the equipment. They don't have any records of maintenance visits during those time periods. Margaret's blood pressure ticked upward. Systematic surveillance gaps during the early morning hours were a classic sign of covert operations, whether criminal or intelligence-related. Either way, it meant Marcus was working in the middle of something potentially very dangerous. Have you documented all this? She asked. I'm keeping notes, but I have to be careful. My computer access is monitored, and I get the feeling that asking too many questions would not be good for my continued employment. Margaret nodded, understanding the impossible position her son found himself in. Walk away from troubling signs, and risk being complicit in whatever illegal activity might be taking place. Investigate too deeply, and risk becoming a liability that needed to be eliminated. After dinner, they walked along the Chicago River, enjoying the relative privacy of the waterfront boardwalk. The city lights reflected off the dark water, creating an almost peaceful atmosphere that belied the tension both of them were feeling. Mom, Marcus said finally, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Margaret braced herself, recognizing the tone he'd used as a child when he was about to ask a question he wasn't sure he wanted the answer to. During your time in the Navy, did you ever encounter situations like this? Companies that looked legitimate on the surface but were really something else? She was quiet for a long moment, weighing how much she could tell him without violating classification restrictions that were still in effect decades after her retirement. Finally, she decided that her son's safety outweighed any bureaucratic concerns about operational security. Yes, she said simply. More often than you might think. Sometimes companies are fronts for intelligence operations, either ours or foreign governments. Sometimes they're covers for criminal organizations that have learned to hide behind corporate respectability. And, sometimes they're legitimate businesses that have been infiltrated or corrupted. How do you tell the difference? You watch the patterns. Money flows, personnel movements, operational security measures that go beyond what legitimate business would require. And, you watch the people, how they behave, what they're afraid of, who they trust. Marcus absorbed this information, clearly thinking through everything he'd observed over the past few weeks. The fear, he said finally. Everyone there is afraid of something, but they won't say what. Fear is a tool, Margaret explained. It keeps people quiet, keeps them compliant. But, it also makes them vulnerable to pressure, and that can work both ways. They stopped at a bench overlooking the water, and Margaret turned to face her son directly. Marcus, I need you to promise me something. If this situation gets worse, if you feel like you're in real danger, you call me immediately. Don't worry about protecting the job, don't worry about starting over again. Nothing is worth risking your life. I know, Mom. I'm being careful. Careful isn't enough if you're dealing with professionals. And, based on what you've described, these people know what they're doing. The next morning, Margaret convinced Marcus to let her take the train back to his neighborhood while he went to work. She wanted to do some more reconnaissance, but she also wanted to give him plausible deniability if anyone asked about her activities. She spent the day visiting local businesses, chatting with store owners and longtime residents under the pretense of learning about the area. What she learned painted a picture of a community that had become increasingly dependent on Brennan Industries, but also increasingly uncomfortable with that dependence. The owner of a small hardware store mentioned that several former Brennan employees had left town suddenly, over the past year, without giving notice or saying goodbye to friends and neighbors. A waitress at a diner said that Brennan workers always paid in cash and never used credit cards, which struck her as odd for people with steady corporate jobs. Most telling was the conversation with an elderly man walking his dog, who told her that his grandson had worked at Brennan for 6 months before quitting without explanation, and had refused to discuss his time there even with family. By late afternoon, Margaret had assembled a pattern that confirmed her worst suspicions. Brennan Industries was running some kind of covert operation, one serious enough to require intimidating employees into silence and eliminating anyone who might pose a threat. The gaps in surveillance footage suggested regular nighttime activities that couldn't withstand scrutiny, while the fear she'd observed in the employees indicated that people had learned what happened to those who asked inconvenient questions. Marcus was walking into a trap, and he might not realize it until it was too late. She was heading back to his apartment when she noticed the car following her. It was good work, a nondescript sedan that stayed 3 or 4 vehicles back, changing positions regularly to avoid detection. But Margaret had been trained by some of the best surveillance specialists in the world, and she'd spent years refining those skills in environments where making a mistake meant death. Instead of leading them back to Marcus's building, she took a detour through a shopping mall, using the multiple entrances and crowded walkways to get a better look at who was tracking her. There were 2 of them, a man and woman in their 30s, both dressed like suburban professionals but moving with the controlled alertness of people accustomed to violence. Margaret ducked into a department store and used the mirrored security monitors to observe them as they split up to cover the exits. They were definitely professionals, probably military or intelligence background based on their positioning and communication patterns. The question was whether they worked for Brennan Industries directly or for whoever was pulling the strings behind the scenes. She spent an hour leading them through a complex route designed to test their capabilities and commitment. They were good, but not exceptional, and, more importantly, they were operating with instructions to observe rather than apprehend. That suggested they were still gathering information rather than preparing to act. Finally, Margaret decided she'd learned enough. She exited through the mall's service corridors, a route that required bypassing several security checkpoints but which she managed through a combination of confidence and misdirection that would have impressed her old instructors. By the time her watchers realized she'd disappeared, she was already 6 blocks away and moving fast. The fact that Brennan Industries had put surveillance on her meant they'd identified her as a potential threat, which in turn meant they were taking Marcus's security concerns seriously enough to investigate his family. That was both good news and bad news. Good because it confirmed that Marcus's instincts were correct, bad because it meant they were both now on someone's radar. Margaret called Marcus from a payphone, one of the few still functioning in the city, and arranged to meet him at a restaurant across town. When he arrived, she could see immediately that something had changed. His shoulders were tighter, his eyes more watchful, and he kept checking the exits in a way that told her his situational awareness had been kicked into high gear. "What happened?" she asked before he'd even sat down. "Someone searched my apartment," Marcus said quietly. "Professional job, nothing obviously disturbed, but things weren't quite where I left them. And, when I got to work this morning, my computer access had been upgraded." "Upgraded how?" "I now have clearance for files I didn't have before, including shipping manifests that show what's really moving through the facility." Marcus paused, clearly struggling with what he'd discovered. "Mom, it's not automotive parts." "I don't know what it is exactly, but the weight and volume specifications don't match anything legitimate." Margaret felt a cold certainty settling in her stomach. "They're testing you." "What do you mean?" "They've figured out that you know something's wrong. Now they're trying to determine whether you can be bought, blackmailed, or scared into compliance. The upgraded access is bait. They want to see what you do with the information." Marcus ran his hands through his hair, a gesture of frustration she remembered from his teenage years. So what do I do? If I report it to the authorities, I'll need evidence, but gathering evidence makes me complicit. If I quit and walk away, I lose everything I've worked for, and they might decide I know too much to live. There's a third option, Margaret said slowly, pieces of a plan beginning to form in her mind. We find out exactly what they're doing and who's behind it. Then, we use that information to protect ourselves. Mom, you're not trained for this kind of thing. Margaret smiled, and, for the first time in the conversation, it reached her eyes. Son, there's a lot about my military service that you don't know. Some of it's still classified, and some of it I just never saw any reason to discuss. But, trust me when I tell you that I'm more qualified for this kind of operation than you might think. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small device that looked like a standard smartphone but was actually a sophisticated piece of surveillance equipment she'd acquired through channels that weren't entirely legal. Tomorrow night, during one of those surveillance gaps you mentioned, we're going to find out what Brennan Industries is really up to. Marcus stared at the device, then, at his mother, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time in his adult life. Mom, what exactly did you do in the Navy? Whatever was necessary to keep this country safe, she replied. And now I'm going to do whatever's necessary to keep my son safe. The next 24 hours felt like the calm before a storm. Margaret spent the day making preparations that would have seemed paranoid to anyone who didn't understand the stakes. She visited 3 different stores across the city, purchasing items that individually seemed innocent but, together formed the basis of a sophisticated surveillance operation. Marcus went to work as usual, but Margaret could see the strain was getting to him. His text messages throughout the day were terse, professional updates that told her nothing substantial but confirmed he was still safe. More importantly, they confirmed he was following her instructions to behave normally while avoiding any actions that might trigger additional scrutiny. At 6 p.m., Margaret was sitting in a coffee shop 6 blocks from Brennan Industries when her phone buzzed with an encrypted message from Marcus, package delivered. Pick up at usual location. Translation: Marcus had successfully planted the microtransmitters she'd given him in strategic locations throughout the facility, and he was leaving work through his normal route. The usual location was a grocery store parking lot where they'd agreed to meet, chosen because it offered multiple exit routes and enough civilian foot traffic to mask a brief conversation. Margaret arrived first, positioning herself where she could observe the entire parking lot while appearing to simply load groceries into a rental car she'd acquired that morning. Marcus appeared 10 minutes later, moving with the casual urgency of someone eager to get home after a long day. To any observer, they looked like a mother and son who'd coincidentally run into each other while running errands. Any problems? She asked as Marcus helped her load bags into the trunk. Security guard asked why I was working late, but I told him I was trying to get caught up on the audit. He seemed to accept it. Marcus glanced around the parking lot, his trained eye automatically checking for surveillance. The devices are in place, one in the main warehouse, one in Brennan's office, one in the loading dock area. Good. Now we wait. They drove separately back to Marcus's apartment, where Margaret had set up her monitoring equipment in the spare bedroom. The devices she'd placed weren't just audio transmitters, they were full-spectrum surveillance units capable of detecting electromagnetic signatures, chemical traces, and even minute vibrations that could indicate the movement of heavy equipment. At 11 p.m., they settled in to wait for the surveillance gap Marcus had identified. Margaret had changed into dark clothing and soft-soled shoes, while Marcus wore the kind of generic casual clothes that would help him blend into any crowd. Neither of them discussed what they would do if their suspicions were confirmed, but both understood that their lives were likely to change permanently before the sun rose. The first transmission came through at 1:47 a.m. voices speaking in what sounded like Russian, followed by the distinctive sound of heavy machinery starting up. Margaret adjusted the audio filters, isolating specific frequencies until the conversation became clearer. Shipment secured. Beginning transfer to secondary location. Confirmed. Transport vehicles standing by at exit 3. Margaret and Marcus exchanged grim looks. Whatever was happening at Brennan Industries, it involved foreign operatives and the movement of material significant enough to require heavy machinery. The systematic nature of the operation suggested this wasn't a one-time event but an established procedure that had been refined over time. The electromagnetic sensors picked up signatures consistent with industrial motors and hydraulic systems, suggesting that large, heavy objects were being moved within the facility. More troubling were the chemical traces detected by the environmental sensors, compounds that could indicate either advanced manufacturing processes or the handling of materials that required special containment procedures. At 2:15 a.m., the audio picked up a new voice, this one speaking accented English with what Margaret recognized as an Eastern European inflection. Final container loaded. Manifest shows delivery to port facility tomorrow night. Understood. Standard security protocols for transport? Affirmative. Clean route, no stops, radio silence until arrival. Margaret felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. Brennan Industries was being used as a waystation for some kind of smuggling operation, with materials arriving during normal business hours under the cover of legitimate shipments, then being transferred to secondary containers during the early morning surveillance gaps. The port facility reference suggested the ultimate destination was overseas, probably back to wherever the operation originated. The question was what exactly was being moved. The weight signatures suggested heavy industrial equipment or raw materials, but the security precautions indicated something with strategic value that would justify the risks and expense of such an elaborate operation. At 2:45 a.m., they got their answer. Uranium processing equipment secured for transport. Radiation levels within acceptable parameters for transit. The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. They weren't dealing with ordinary smuggling or even conventional weapons trafficking. Someone was using Brennan Industries to move materials related to nuclear technology, equipment that could be used to refine uranium for weapons programs. Marcus went pale beside her, understanding immediately what this meant. They had stumbled onto an operation that represented a direct threat to national security, the kind of discovery that could trigger international incidents or military interventions. "We have to call the FBI," Marcus whispered. Margaret held up a hand, signaling for silence. The transmissions were continuing, and she wanted to capture as much intelligence as possible before they made any decisions about how to proceed. Transport route confirmed. Chicago port to Hamburg, then overland to final destination. Customs documentation shows industrial machinery for automotive manufacturing. Security sweep complete. No signs of surveillance or interference. Operation proceeds as scheduled. Margaret made rapid notes, capturing names, times, and routing information that would be crucial for any law enforcement response. But even as she worked, her mind was racing through the implications of what they'd discovered. Whoever was running this operation had infiltrated a legitimate American business and was using it to support what was almost certainly a foreign nuclear weapons program. The sophistication of the security measures, the systematic corruption of the company's operations, and the involvement of what sounded like professional intelligence operatives suggested this was a state-sponsored operation rather than a criminal enterprise. That made it exponentially more dangerous for anyone who might threaten to expose it. At 3:30 a.m., the transmission ceased and the facility returned to normal electromagnetic signatures. The surveillance gap had ended, and whatever had been accomplished during those 90 minutes was now complete. Margaret powered down her equipment and turned to face her son. In the dim light of the spare bedroom, she could see her own concerns reflected in his expression, the understanding that they had crossed a line from which there might be no return. "We can't go to the FBI," she said finally. "What?" "Mom, this is nuclear material we're talking about. This is terrorism, espionage, maybe both." We have an obligation to stay alive," Margaret interrupted. "Think about what we've discovered. This operation has been running for months, maybe years. It involves corruption at multiple levels of a legitimate business, professional operatives with military-grade equipment, and enough resources to maintain sophisticated security measures." Marcus started to object, but she held up her hand. "That kind of operation doesn't exist without protection. Someone in the government, probably multiple someones, knows what's happening at Brennan Industries and has decided to allow it to continue. Maybe they're building a larger case, maybe they're being bribed, or maybe they're complicit. But, if we walk into an FBI field office with this information, we might be handing it to the very people who are supposed to be preventing it. The weight of this realization settled over both of them. They possessed information that could potentially prevent nuclear materials from reaching hostile nations, but they had no way of knowing who they could trust with that information. In the complex world of international intelligence operations, allies and enemies were often indistinguishable until it was too late. So what do we do? Marcus asked. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, considering options that ranged from immediately leaving the country to attempting to disrupt the operation themselves. Finally, she reached a decision that drew on everything she'd learned during her years in naval intelligence. We find out who's really behind this. Names, faces, organizational structure. Then, we identify someone in the government who definitely isn't compromised and deliver the intelligence through channels that can't be intercepted or suppressed. And how exactly do we do that without getting killed in the process? Margaret smiled grimly. Very carefully. And by using the fact that they still see you as a potential asset rather than a confirmed threat. Over the next hour, she outlined a plan that would require Marcus to continue working at Brennan Industries while gathering additional intelligence, but with surveillance and backup that would hopefully prevent him from disappearing like the other employees who had asked too many questions. It was dangerous, possibly suicidal, but it was also the only option that offered any chance of stopping the operation while keeping them alive long enough to see justice done. There's one more thing you need to know, Margaret said as they prepared to try to get a few hours of sleep before dawn. During my time in the Navy, I wasn't just in intelligence. I was part of a special operations unit that handled situations exactly like this one, foreign infiltration operations that required unconventional responses. Marcus stared at her, understanding that his mother was revealing something she had never intended to share. What kind of unit? The kind that officially doesn't exist. The kind that takes care of problems that can't be solved through normal channels. She paused, choosing her words carefully. I still have contacts in that community, people who understand how to handle situations where the normal rules don't apply. You're talking about calling in vigilantes. I'm talking about calling in professionals who put national security above bureaucratic politics. People who can act on intelligence like this without worrying about who might be embarrassed or exposed in the process. Marcus absorbed this information, realizing that his mother was offering him a choice between trusting the system that had failed to detect the Brennan Industries operation in the first place, or trusting a shadow network of operators who existed outside that system entirely. What are the risks? He asked finally. If we go through official channels and we're wrong?